Here's a question that sounds like it's about math, but it's actually about something much bigger. If I give you enough dials to turn, enough knobs to adjust, can I make a model that explains anything? The answer is yes, and that should terrify you. This graph, let's start here. The blue dots are data. The orange curves are models trying to explain that data. On the left, simple models, 3 parameters each. They catch the general shape, but they miss a lot. On the right, complex models, 20 parameters. They trace the data almost perfectly. Here's the problem. These two models, the sine and the polynomial, both fit the data beautifully, and they contradict each other completely. The same evidence, 2 incompatible conclusions, both proven by the data. This phenomenon has a name. Statisticians call it overfitting, and once you understand it, you'll start seeing it everywhere, in science, in history, in literary analysis. And as I want to show you today, at the heart of one of the most influential theories in modern biblical scholarship. For over 100 years, one of the flagship achievements of modern biblical criticism was something called the documentary hypothesis. The basic idea was beautiful in its simplicity in certain ways, albeit wrong. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, they said wasn't written by a single author. Instead, scholars argued it was stitched together from 4 major independent sources. The first one using the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, vivid anthropomorphic storytelling. The second one preferring the name Elohim, more distant, more formal. Third, the Deuteronomist behind Deuteronomy, and they said related books, a distinctive legal and rhetorical style. The Priestly source, systematic, genealogical, concerned with ritual. Whether you agreed with this theory or not, it has perhaps something going from it from a scientific perspective. It was parsimonious. 4 sources, a coherent reconstruction, a manageable number of explanatory variables, accounting for a significant amount of data. In the language of statistics, a low-parameter model with significant predictive power. You could argue about the conclusions. You could say that a single brilliant author naturally shifts tone between law, poetry, and narrative, as any writer does in truth. You could argue that divine communication itself might speak in multiple registers, as Rav Brewer did in Germany. Those are legitimate counterarguments. But at least the original theory was a theory in the classical sense. It made specific claims that could, in principle, be tested. That's not where things stand today. Over time, the neat 4-source model ran into trouble. New textual evidence didn't cooperate. Internal tensions multiplied. The clean boundaries between J, E, D, and P started blurring. So what did scholars do? They added parameters. More sources were proposed, then redactors, editors who combined the sources, then redactors of those redactors, then post-exilic editors, pre-priestly traditions, supplementary hypotheses layered on top of fragmentary hypotheses. Today, there is no single dominant reconstruction. Scholars who study this professionally often disagree substantially, not on minor details, but on which sources existed at all, when they were composed, and how they were combined, as pointed out by Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman. I want you to hold that image in your mind, the 20-parameter graph, because that's exactly what happened here. When the simple model didn't fit perfectly, scholars added complexity, and added it again and again, until eventually they had a model flexible enough to explain almost any configuration of the text. And that's the moment a model stops proving anything, because a model that can explain anything has no predictive power left. And even within the 4 sources, they were able to choose certain words and definitions in such a way so as to get a fit where probably the original model also was overfit in a sense. The diagnostic features that stopped diagnosing. In machine learning, one of the clearest warning signs of overfitting is when your supposedly diagnostic features stop working. You can build a model. You say, whenever we see feature X, it tells us that the data came from source A. Then new data arrives, and feature X shows up everywhere. Now it doesn't diagnose anything. This has happened repeatedly in biblical scholarship. So let me walk you through a few of the most striking examples. The Lachish Comb. In 2022, attention returned to a remarkable artifact, the Lachish Comb, an ivory comb dating to roughly the 17th century BCE. It contains a complete sentence in early alphabetic writing, one of the oldest inscriptions ever found. What stopped scholars in their tracks was the grammar. A specific grammatical construction in that sentence matched a usage found in biblical Hebrew, one that had often been cited as evidence for late composition. That feature was supposed to be a chronological marker, a timestamp pointing to a later period. Suddenly, the timestamp appeared roughly 1,000 years earlier than expected. One revision in a theory isn't fatal. Science adapts. But when you're building a dating method on features that keep turning out to be older than you thought, that should meaningfully reduce your confidence in the method itself. Next, For decades, many scholars held the clean rule, asher in early Hebrew, versus she in late Hebrew, the word that. See she in a text, and you had reason to date it later. Then more Northwest Semitic inscriptions accumulated. The picture complicated. Many scholars now believe these two forms may simply reflect different registers of language, formal versus colloquial, written versus spoken. Rather than different eras, what looked like a timestamp may have been a stylistic choice. Another widely used dating method, spelling. Older texts, it was assumed, used defective spellings. Newer texts filled in more vowel letters. This seemed reasonable. Then more ancient inscriptions appeared showing spelling variations far earlier than expected. Worse, the scribes in various sects would often update the spelling of texts as they copied them. So even if a text had late spelling, that might just reflect a later copyist, not a later author. Scholars like Ian Young, Robert Rosetko, and Martin Ehrensvard have argued that linguistic dating based on these features is considerably less precise than the field was assumed. Next, the Quebec FIFA Astrakhan. Some arguments against early biblical composition rested on a similar premise, that widespread literacy didn't exist in early Israel. Then this Astrakhan was discovered, an administrative inscription showing sophisticated writing from roughly the 10th century BCE. It didn't prove Mosaic authorship, it didn't settle anything by itself, but it demonstrated that a foundational assumption had been wrong. And when a foundational assumption turns out to be wrong, every argument that it rested on needs to be re-examined. So I want to step back from the specific examples, because there's a more fundamental issue at stake. Imagine for a moment that the Torah were human authored, chas v'shalom. What would scholars do? They'd search for human authors, naturally. Now imagine if it were divinely authored. What would scholars do? They'd still search for human authors. If the text contained repetitions, they'd identify multiple sources. If it contained tensions, they'd identify editors. If it seemed to predict future events, they'd date it after those events. If it contained unfamiliar vocabulary, they'd call it an interpolation. No matter what the text looked like, a skeptical reconstruction could be generated. This is true of the four-theme model, the documentary hypothesis as it was originally stated, and is of course true of current models. And that should make us cautious. Not because the scholars are doing something dishonest. Most are fine, smart, careful people. But because a test that produces a positive result, regardless of what the data looks like, is not actually a test. In the philosophy of science, we call this unfalsifiability. A theory that can explain every possible outcome can be confirmed by no particular outcome. And a model that can be fit to any data has not discovered the signal, it has merely absorbed the noise. Now here's a question that almost never gets asked directly. If the Torah were divinely authored, what would we expect it to look like? The implicit assumption in a lot of critical scholarship is that it should look like a modern book, written by a single author, internally uniform, stylistically consistent. But why should we assume that? The Torah is not simply a narrative, it's a legal code, a covenant document, a national history, a theological treatise, a foundation for a living oral tradition spanning millennia, the reflection of an infinite creator. Maybe a text that should contain multiple voices, because it speaks to multiple dimensions of human experience simultaneously. Maybe it should generate tensions that provoke deeper interpretation across generations. Maybe its apparent complexity is a feature, not a flaw. I'm not arguing that this proves divine authorship. I'm a physicist. That's not how proof works. What I'm arguing is narrower. Literary and linguistic complexity does not disprove divine authorship. And a methodology that would conclude multiple human authors, regardless of what the text contained, hasn't actually proven anything at all. So let's return to where we started, that graph. Two models, 20 parameters each, both fitting the same data beautifully, both contradicting each other completely. The lesson isn't that models are useless. Models are essential. We can't think without them. The lesson is humility, about what fitting the data actually proves. When a theory keeps adding new sources, new editors, new redactors, new layers, each time the evidence doesn't cooperate, as is true of biblical criticism and modern biblical archaeology, that's not a theory getting stronger, that's a model accumulating parameters. And when multiple incompatible models all fit the same data, the evidence isn't pointing clearly to any of them. The honest response, the scientifically honest response, is not certainty, it's caution. The data are messier than people once thought. The confidence should be lower. And sometimes the wisest thing a careful thinker can say, whether they're a statistician, a physicist, or a biblical scholar, is we don't know as much as we thought we did. That's not defeat, that's intellectual honesty. And in the long run, it's the only foundation on which genuine understanding can be built. Some weeks ago, we had Shavuos. When we received the Torah, it was on Har Sinai, the lowest of all places. So if this kind of thinking where statistics meets theology, meets history, is interesting to you, I go much deeper on the intersection of physics, epistemology, and faith in my book, Emunah in Physics. Link is in the description. If you found this video worth your time, the best thing you can do is to share it with someone who would enjoy arguing about it. And I'll see you in the next one.